Topic 2, thinking about Islam. So I'd like to start with some basic facts so that we can move forward together. First, the traditional context of Islam's origins. Well, on this topic, why not start with what we know historically about the geography and the chronology and the demography that is the characteristic of the peoples that were around at the origins of Islam. In this regard, we're interested in the context of the Arabian Peninsula, most of which is now the modern-day country of Saudi Arabia, in the late 6th and early 7th century. And just to give you a hint about the traditional biography of the Prophet Muhammad's life, that will sort of help us present with some more grounding the historical context of Islam. The traditional date for the birth of the Prophet Muhammad is 570. The traditional date for his call to prophethood is 610. And the traditional death date for the Prophet Muhammad is 632. Now, about this time, in the late 6th, early 7th century, in the Arabian Peninsula, we find that the lands around the traditional spot in which we usually locate the origin of Islam, namely the city of Mecca, about which I'll speak more presently, but the lands around Mecca were largely Christian. And in some way, if we accept the traditional notion that Mecca was a pagan city, I'll speak about this too when I mention more about the city of Muhammad's birth, then Mecca would seem to have been a pagan island within a sea of Christianity. Indeed, to the north were the lands of Palestine and Syria, which were the Christian homelands, the spot in which the church was born. To the west were the countries in the extreme northeastern corner of Africa, Egypt and Ethiopia, Christian countries. To the east were Iraq and Persia across the Persian or Arabian Gulf, which by this time had been largely Christianized. Of course, there was a native religion to Iran, which was Zoroastrianism. But a large portion of Iranians had become Christian by the time of the late 6th, early 7th century. Even to the south of the Arabian Peninsula, we know that many of the peoples that were in those lands which today are more or less equivalent with the modern-day countries of Yemen and Oman, had become Christian at this time. Indeed, many of the Arabian tribes that were even often in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, we know had become Christian. So that's the setting we know sort of from traditional historical sources, from non-Islamic historical sources about Islam's origins. It came at a time when the Roman Empire had faded away, where there were two great empires in the east. One was the Byzantine Empire, which was in some ways the descendant of the Roman Empire, first the Eastern Roman Empire, and then after the conversion of Constantine to Christianity, it became known as the Byzantine Empire, and further to the east, the Sasanian or Persian empires. The Arabian Peninsula, where the traditional site of Islam's origins would be located, was outside of the borders of both of these two great empires. This is very general information, and we don't know much more. None of our sources, our historical sources, tell us much about what took place at this time in the interior of the Arabian Peninsula. For this reason, when we look at the traditional material on the context of Islam's origins, we might, more than asking, what does this tell us about how things really took place, we might ask, what does this tell us about the ways in which Muslims wanted to present Islam's origins? Well, in this regard, we notice that the Islamic sources emphasize two aspects of the origin, in particular of the city in which Islam originated, namely Mecca. Mecca is a city located on the western side of the Arabian Peninsula, inland but not far from the Red Sea. And according to the Islamic sources, it was a pagan city. Indeed, Islamic sources would say, yes, there were Christians around. There were Christians to the north in Syria or Palestine, Christians on the other side of the Red Sea in Egypt and Ethiopia, but not in Mecca. Mecca was a pagan city. It was, in some ways, the last bastion of an old pagan culture. And what we mean by pagan is a bit difficult to explain. Pagan's a funny word. It's used very generally. We could have included this under the category, the problem with words. But in this context, when we use the word pagan, we mean effectively polytheism marked by idolatry. So the traditional Islamic sources tell us that there was a pagan religious cult that was centered in Mecca. That is, not only were Meccans pagans themselves, polytheists themselves, but they were the home team for polytheism. Because in the city of Mecca, at the center of the city, was a black building, which was a pagan shrine in which the idols of the various Arab tribes were housed. And that building is the Kaaba. The Kaaba, you may know, is the black building which today Muslims process around 7 times during the annual Islamic pilgrimage, the Hajj. But Islamic sources tell us before the Prophet Muhammad conquered Mecca towards the end of his life, it was in the control of pagans and it was a house of idols.